They say the husband is always the last to know. I used to think that showering a woman with love, giving her undivided attention, and fulfilling her every wish would make her realize how fortunate she was to have me. But I don't see it that way anymore. Now, I feel like all that devotion just sets me up to be taken for granted. It gives her the idea that there's nothing she could do that I wouldn't overlook or excuse. Angela and I met during freshman year of college. We started dating pretty early on, and by the end of that first year we were in an on-again, off-again relationship. We genuinely enjoyed each other's company, and our intimacy felt strong, but neither of us was quite ready for anything long-term. Then, halfway through our senior year we reconnected and this time we stuck together. 6 months after graduating we got married. Soon after, my parents celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. At the party I managed to get my dad alone for a moment and asked him how he and mom had stayed so happy for so many years. I pointed to some other couples we knew who couldn't seem to go a week without bickering over something. How do you and mom keep things smooth while others seem to struggle? My dad looked at me with a grin and said, "The trick, son, is to remind her every day that you love her. Show it to her constantly, don't ever assume she just knows. Every single day, make sure she feels it. That's the key." Taking his words to heart, I made it a point to tell Angela I loved her daily. Not a day passed when I didn't acknowledge her or celebrate an occasion, big or small. Birthdays, anniversaries, and even those nonsense anniversaries got special attention. I'd send her flowers on the anniversary of her first promotion or the first time she made meatloaf. Even the day we bought our washer and dryer became a reason for a surprise gift. There were times I'd send flowers to her office for no occasion other than to remind her of my love. I'd do whatever I could to show her how much she meant to me. I believed I was following my dad's advice perfectly. But my dad's example didn't account for how differently people might interpret the same gestures. While my mom saw those acts as signs of my dad's unending love, Angela began to see them as signs of insecurity, as if I was trying to buy her attention. Somehow, my attempts at showing love started to lessen my value in her eyes. I had no clue about this, of course, and carried on believing I had a strong, loving marriage. Meanwhile, our careers were taking off, and we were both climbing the corporate ladder. As work responsibilities increased, so did the long hours, the late nights, and even business trips. There were nights we hardly saw each other, with one of us often asleep before the other got home. I assumed this was just part of our path to success and figured Angela saw it the same way. Whenever we were together, I'd do my best to make up for the time apart. We'd spend whole weekends in each other's arms, Angela telling me I'd have her forever, and I wholeheartedly believed it. Then came her company's Christmas party. It was held at a downtown hotel, with a ballroom rented out for the event and several rooms set aside for guests. The party was on a Wednesday night, and I'd told Angela I'd meet her there. I had a client in town and needed to get them on an 8 p.m. flight, so I mentioned she shouldn't expect me until around 8:30. But the client ended up staying an extra day, and I got to the party early, around 7:30. As I walked into the ballroom, I spotted Angela with a man I didn't recognize. That wasn't too surprising since I hadn't met most of her colleagues outside of a few company picnics and holiday events. But it was odd to see her with her arm around his waist. Curious, I followed as they stepped out into a hallway. There was a small lobby area with 3 rooms branching off, and I wondered which one they had entered. I checked the closest room, but it was empty, as was the next one. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a light giggle. The sound seemed to be coming from the ceiling vent. That's when it hit me, I could hear what was happening in the room next door. I was just about to head over when I caught Angela's voice saying, "Careful, you don't want to tear your dress, do you?" Then came another voice replying, "Well, how am I supposed to reach you from here?" Angela responded with a teasing, "Let me show you." Then came a murmur, "Angela, I could look at you all night long." I heard the distinct sound of a zipper being pulled up, followed by Angela's voice saying, "Now, that's something I'll never tire of." She added, "Are you sure we don't have time to slip into one of these rooms for a quick round? I need you." Her companion replied, "Come on, love, we just had lunch together and we spent 3 hours in bed on Monday night. Can't you hold out until tomorrow?" Angela, sounding disappointed, said, "I don't think I can." He sighed, "Well, you'll have to. Bob said he'd be here around 8:30, and I've got to be here when he arrives. If he comes in early and catches me looking freshly loved, he might get suspicious and start snooping around, and we don't want that, do we? Come on, Rena, he pressed, if your husband is as clueless as you say, we could practically make love right in front of him, and he wouldn't notice. Angela laughed softly. Maybe, but just because I know I could doesn't mean I want to push it. Are you sure we can't sneak up to one of the suites? He asked again, almost pleading. I don't want to take any chances, but I can still take the edge off for you, she said. After a pause, the man groaned in pleasure. Mason's voice chimed in with a mix of frustration and amusement. Mason will throw a fit when I tell him you were with me, and he'll have to wait until tomorrow. Or maybe he won't. But I thought we weren't doing anything tonight, she teased. I said we wouldn't go up to the guest suite, he clarified. I didn't say anything about keeping our hands to ourselves. Angela laughed in that familiar, mischievous way. That's what you love about me, isn't it? She said. Come on, we should get back to the party. Listening to all this, I felt my love for her crumble, turning to absolute hatred in seconds. My mind raced, should I kick down the door and make a scene or sit tight and use what I'd overheard to plan my next steps? If I acted now, it would just be my word against hers in court, and she'd likely deny everything. I needed more information. If I confronted them, I might never figure out who Mason was or if she was involved with anyone else. I'd get my revenge, but it wouldn't be tonight. I slipped out of the building, walking briskly to my car, barely holding back the urge to storm back in. When I returned to the ballroom later, Angela was seated at a table with two couples and a single man. She noticed me approaching and stood up, arms wide to greet me, leaning in for a kiss. But I turned my face slightly, letting her kiss land on my cheek instead. I saw the surprise flicker across her face. I think I'm coming down with something, sunshine. Wouldn't want to pass it on to you, I said. She nodded, a bit uncertain, and introduced me to the others at the table. The man next to her, Ron, stood to shake my hand, and I guessed he was about my height, around 6 feet. His slick black hair and razor-thin mustache instantly gave him a smarmy look. We sat down and I made small talk with Angela's colleagues. The two couples seemed restless, like they were waiting for something to happen. I danced a couple of songs with Angela, and during the second one she whispered in my ear, "That little bug you've got won't stop you from making love to me tonight, will it?" I forced a smile. "We'll just have to wait and see how I'm feeling when we get home," I replied casually. She had no idea that she would never be touching me again. After the song, we returned to the table. Another man was seated there now, deep in conversation with Ron, and Angela introduced him as Mason. He was about 5 feet 10 inches and looked to be around 180 pounds, with soft hands and a weak chin, details I made a point of remembering. After a few minutes, Mason excused himself to visit some folks at another table. My eyes tracked him as he made his way down the hallway, the same hallway that led to the room where I'd overheard him earlier with Angela. A few minutes later, Angela got up, kissed me on the cheek, and mentioned she was going to the restroom. As she walked away, Ron turned to me and asked, "So, what do you think of the Broncos' chances this season?" His casual attempt at conversation felt rehearsed, and I could tell Angela had probably told him I was a big football fan. He was just trying to keep me occupied while she slipped away to meet Mason. As I chatted with Ron about soccer, I kept a careful eye on the door where Mason had exited, and sure enough, less than a minute later, Angela slipped through it as well. She was gone for close to 15 minutes, but I continued my conversation with Ron, pretending not to notice how long she'd been away. I wondered if Ron realized what had just happened. Angela had clearly just had her moment with Mason, giving him a little more than she'd given Ron that evening. I doubted anyone else at the table noticed, but after a decade of marriage, I could read Angela like a book. I don't think she realized I knew her that well. When she returned, I led her back onto the dance floor, and as we swayed, she pressed close against me. "Please, don't let me down tonight," she whispered. "If this party wasn't so damn important, I'd get you out of here right now." When we returned to the table, Mason approached and asked her for a dance. As they glided onto the floor, I caught a smirk from one of the women at the table, directed squarely at me. The old saying drifted through my mind, "The husband is always the last to know." After Mason returned her to the table, Ron immediately took her for another spin, and I watched the two women at the table exchange knowing smiles. I filed it away, if her affair was common knowledge at her office, it wouldn't take much to uncover more. Angela danced with several people she reported to, and then spent about 15 minutes chatting at her boss's table. When she came back, she leaned in and whispered, "All right, lover, I've danced with everyone I needed to. Let's head home, I need you tonight." Since we had driven separately, I gave her a head start, wanting her to get home, undressed and ready in the bedroom. That way, she'd be in just the right position for what I had planned. I took my time on the drive, making sure she'd have enough time to settle in. When I got home, I went straight upstairs through the bedroom and into the bathroom, where I pretended to suffer an explosive bout of food poisoning. I sat on the toilet, adding all the appropriate sounds for several minutes, then flushed the water and wiped my face with a damp washcloth. When I walked back into the bedroom, there was Angela, lying naked on the bed, ready and waiting. "I'm so sorry, baby," I told her, holding my stomach, "but whatever I've got, I'm not going to risk giving it to you. I'll sleep in the spare room tonight, and I'll call the doctor in the morning." I could see the frustration on her face as I left the room. The next morning I was up before Angela and sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and doing my best to look unwell. When she came in, she asked, "Feeling any better?" "Not really," I replied, shaking my head. "I barely slept, but I'll give the doctor's office a call as soon as they open at 8:30. I picked up the phone, and as she poured herself some coffee, she mentioned, "Don't forget, I'll be working late tonight. We're still pushing to get that budget proposal wrapped up, and it should be ready by next Tuesday." "Yeah, sure, you'll be late," I thought, setting the phone down without actually making the call. After Angela left, I went to my office, wrapped up any loose tasks, and informed the receptionist I'd be out the rest of the day for a doctor's appointment. Then I headed straight to the public library. There I got my hands on reference books and found addresses and phone numbers for Ronald Bragg and Mason Travail. Using the library computers, I pulled up information about Angela's company, including details on the officers and board members. As I scanned the biographies of the top executives, I made mental notes about which ones might react strongly to a scandal. From what I could see, even a whiff of impropriety could be enough to knock Angela, Ron, and Mason right out of their positions. That night, I parked near Angela's office and waited. She left the building around 1005 and drove across town, with me following at a discreet distance. She pulled into a motel parking lot, got out, and walked up to room 131. She knocked and Mason opened the door, stepping aside to let her in. About 20 minutes later, Ron pulled up, got out, and joined them in room 131. I could only assume this was the budget meeting they'd be working on that night. I wondered if her company realized their employees were so dedicated, working on the proposal off hours and on their own dime, or maybe not. Perhaps they'd even turn in an expense report for this meeting. I jotted down the make, model, and license plate of Ron's car before heading home. As I drove, I mulled over everything I'd learned about Ron and Mason. Both men were married, though I didn't know much about their personal lives or whether they had any happiness at home. What I did know was that neither of them had attended the corporate event as Angela's date. I needed to dig deeper, to get Ron and Mason tangled in my plan to burn Angela's little world to the ground. As I replayed the last few days in my mind, certain patterns jumped out, things I'd overlooked before. Angela had always stayed late at work on Mondays and Thursdays. She used to tell me that Mondays dragged on because they were dealing with issues from the weekend, and Thursdays were dedicated to wrapping up reports due on Friday. And I, trusting her without a second thought, accepted it all without question. I was completely blinded by love, unable to see the obvious signs. Lying in bed with my book, I heard her come in that night. I quickly turned off the light, set the book aside, and pretended to be asleep. She peeked into the room, then shut the door softly and headed to the bathroom. Moments later, I heard the shower running. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, wrestling with the desire to ruin all three of them at once. I knew that if I wanted to make it stick, I'd have to hit them simultaneously, without giving anyone time to react or cover up. Only when it was over would I reveal to them who was behind it. And as I lay there, an idea sparked. I sat up, turned on the light, and picked up the murder mystery I'd been reading. The story was about a man wrongfully convicted, facing execution due to evidence that had been planted. A lawyer and a private investigator were racing against the clock to prove his innocence. That could be enough, I thought, setting the book down and turning off the light again. Now that I knew what I had to do, sleep finally came and I slept soundly. On Friday morning I told Angela the doctor had diagnosed me with a stomach bug, and with a few meds and some rest, I'd be good to go by Monday. I'm still a bit weak, but he thinks I'll be fine if I just take it easy over the weekend. Angela touched my cheek and gave me a look. Rest up and build your strength, love. I'll need it, I've been deprived too long, she teased, then headed out to work. Once she left, I gathered my things and drove off to do some more digging. By day's end, I'd learned that Ron's wife worked as a legal secretary and had been out of town during the party, visiting her sick mother. Mason's wife, on the other hand, was a real estate agent who'd missed the event because she was closing a multi-million-dollar deal. Both marriages seemed stable enough, likely because neither woman had any clue about their husbands' double lives. I planned to fix that soon. After a quiet weekend at home, I assured Angela that I was ready to head back to work Monday. I'm still a bit under the weather, but as long as I don't push it, I'll be fine, I said. That night, I tailed her to the same motel. This time she met Ron at the door to room 146, who welcomed her inside. 5 minutes later, Mason arrived and joined them. I jotted down Mason's car information and drove back home, still occupying the spare bedroom. When Angela came in, I pretended to be fast asleep. I needed an excuse to keep my distance a bit longer, something that wouldn't arouse her suspicion, but would buy me more time to lay my plans. And then it struck me I'd use one of Angela's own tactics. Whenever we had an argument, Angela would shut down any physical affection until she was good and ready to make amends. It was as though she could turn me off like a switch. Now I knew why she could go for months without a touch. She wasn't cutting herself off, she was only cutting me off. I decided to give her a taste of her own medicine. On Tuesday evening, Angela was already waiting for me when I got home. "How are you feeling, babe?" she asked. "Much better," I replied. "But I'll need a bit more time to get my energy back." She leaned closer, hinting at her eagerness for some time together. I spent the entire day thinking of a way to push her buttons enough that she'd be the one to pull back. Then, just before I left the office, I had an idea. I was heading toward the elevator when a woman from the records department walked in front of me. She was wearing slacks and I couldn't help but notice her figure. That's when I knew exactly what I'd do. After dinner that night we cleared the table, and as Angela washed the dishes I dried them and put them away. When she was done, she pulled me toward the bedroom, already peeling off her clothes along the way. How she could be so eager for me, knowing what she really thought of me, was beyond me. But she'd be the last to know that tonight would change things forever. Once in the bedroom, she lay on the bed, completely naked. I was rough with her more than she expected, and when it was over she leapt up, furious. "You're disgusting," she spat, storming out of the room. She didn't speak to me for the rest of the week, not that I was heartbroken about it. I knew there was risk in my plan. If things went wrong, I'd be the one left ruined. But I was ready to take that risk, driven by the need to see Angela, Ron and Mason brought down, even if it meant going down with them. It cost a pretty penny, but if this worked out, it would be the best investment I'd ever make. A few discreet phone calls to people who knew people led me to just the right contact, and after a midnight meeting in a dimly lit parking lot, I had everything I needed. By the next Sunday, my plan was in motion. When Angela left for work that Monday, I knew there was no turning back. That evening, I followed her to the motel. Once she and her partners were holed up in room 136, I moved in. Ron's car was unlocked, so I popped the trunk and tucked half a pound of marijuana behind the spare tire. Mason's car was locked, but I'd come prepared with a Slim Jim I'd picked up from a tool dealer, so I opened it up, planted a full pound of weed, and sprinkled some on the bumper to ensure it got noticed. I then drove a short distance away to a pay phone, called the police, and reported an active drug deal at room 136 of the Seabreeze Motel, giving the license plate numbers for Angela, Ron, and Mason's cars. When the operator asked for my name, I quickly answered, "You won't set me up with some cartel guys," and hung up. From another payphone, I called the local TV stations, giving them the same details. The city had just elected a new mayor, who'd promised a hard line on drugs, so I knew both the police and media would jump on this. Finally, I called Ron and Mason's wives, letting them know their husbands were with a woman at the Seabreeze Motel. Then I parked a safe distance away to watch the show unfold. Within minutes, the police arrived. First came a couple of squad cars, then a SWAT van, and eventually 2 unmasked cars with detectives. The TV crews had set up by then, capturing every moment. As I watched, the SWAT team used a battering ram to break down the door, and a group of armed officers charged in. I'd have paid anything to see Angela's face when they burst in. After a few minutes, they led Angela, Mason, and Ron out in handcuffs. Mason and Ron were both in their underwear, and Angela, wrapped in a blanket, was clearly naked underneath. Savoring the moment, I pressed a button on my cell phone and called the president of Angela's company. "Did you know some of your mid-level execs are running a drug ring out of your offices?" I asked, giving him the names and directing him to the Seabreeze Motel. Then I called each board member, repeating the story before heading home. During the search, police found the weed I'd planted in Ron and Mason's cars and a few ounces of cocaine in Angela's purse, along with more stashed under the seat of her car. I didn't know if Ron or Mason's wives were in the crowd that night, but I hoped they saw everything. That night, the arrests made the 10 o'clock news on channels 2 and 7. The anchor on Channel 7 seemed especially pleased to announce, newly elected Mayor Jones is keeping his promise to combat drugs. Police today dismantled a significant drug operation at a local motel. They even showed footage of my 3 drug kingpins in cuffs and promised updates. Content: I shut off the TV, unplugged the phone, and went to bed. The next day, Angela begged me to mortgage the house to cover her bail. I refused, and she finally talked her parents into it. But when she got home, she found all the locks changed, and her belongings stacked in boxes in the driveway. "Why are you doing this?" she cried. "Because you're a cheater and I'm finished with you," I replied coolly. "If you'd just let me explain," she stammered. I cut her off. "I got all the explanation I needed watching you get let out naked from a motel on the evening news," I said, and I shut the door in her face. Her father showed up with a U-Haul, and I helped him load up her things, keeping any conversation strictly to her belongings. Angela tried calling me several times a day, but I never answered. When she showed up at my office, I had security escort her out. Not long after, Angela, Ron, and Mason were let go from their jobs, and the mayor's new anti-drug stance meant no leniency in court. Despite being first-time offenders, they didn't get probation, thanks in part to their insistence on denying guilt, even as the evidence piled up against them. And that, as they say, was that. Angela made a serious mistake when she demanded a blood test to prove she hadn't been using drugs. The test did indeed show she was clean, but it backfired spectacularly. The prosecutor used it to argue that the drugs found in her purse and car were clearly for sale, not personal use. With the mayor looking to show quick progress on his war on drugs, the 3 were given a deal: 1 year in jail and 2,000 hours of community service, with a chance for early release in 9 months if they behaved. Their lawyer warned them that taking the deal was their best option, and so reluctantly they accepted. While Angela was serving her sentence, I filed for divorce. Ron's wife and Mason's wife did the same. After they finished their time, I made it a point to keep tabs on all 3 of them. Not long after they were released, I paid Mason a visit. By the time he made it to the ER, he was nursing 3 broken ribs and a fractured arm. I'm sure he considered pressing charges, but I was willing to take my chances in court. Any jury hearing a story about a man who stomped the guy who'd been sleeping with his wife would likely sympathize. Perhaps Mason felt guilty, or maybe he decided it wasn't worth the hassle. Either way, he didn't push it further. As for Ron, he'd moved in with Angela, and one evening I caught them leaving a bar together. After I finished with Ron and gave him a solid 6th kick to the groin, I turned to Angela. "Not bad for a weakling, huh, Angela?" I reminded her of the Christmas party, the time she'd snuck off with Ron. "Remember when he said if he's as weak as you say, we could make love right in front of him and he'd never know?" I saw the realization hit her, her face changing as she connected the dots. I laughed, savoring the moment. "That's right, Rena. The weakling got his revenge." I left her standing there, staring after me in shock, as I climbed into my car and drove away,